So thank you for inviting me to do this. Something that's been bugging me for the last couple of months, maybe a little longer than that. Some questions that have been bugging me about that. And it occurred to me when I was doing this that the first time I sat with Sasaki Roshi and the group was over 30 years ago in Cimarron, at the Summer on the Sutras, when I was lecturing on some of my PhD work at the time. So there's a little history there, but there's a big space in between. So it's good to be back in touch with the group. I don't think Sasaki Roshi sat in on the lectures, but we did have dinner with him on several occasions. So it was a great opportunity for my wife and myself at the time. So I also want to say that I'm impressed with your Zendo and particularly the perspective of the video. Excuse my cracking voice. It has to do with age. Sometimes I have to push the air a little harder. But obviously it's intentional. The way the reflections and the light were coming in through the doors was quite impressive. And it created a frame around the altar. And that's more or less where I'm going to go with part of what I'm going to say this morning is framing, which is what I think the Four Vows have something to do with. And let me start by saying that the first thing one has to acknowledge about the Four Vows is over the past 1,500 years or so, it's been illegible to most people. The meaning of the words was lost. They didn't play a significant part in what was happening in the use of the Four Vows. When it was first composed in Chinese, it was obviously drawing on Sanskrit terms and phrases and concepts, but originating apparently in the Keigo or Huayan tradition sometime around the third or fourth centuries. It was translated into classical Chinese. And classical Chinese, if you're not familiar with it, is not very comprehensible to the ordinary speaker, the vernacular speaker. So it would have been a problem for them, not for monks who had been trained in these concepts and ideas, but for many of the people reciting them, it would have been incomprehensible. When we come to the 8th century and the Platform Sutra of Huineng, he provides a commentary on it. It wouldn't obviously be understood at face value. In fact, he does what Dogen later does, is he completely converts it into a topic for presenting his own particular views on practice and the meaning of the concepts. And by the time it gets to Japan, the Chinese characters remain, and the vows are recited as you recited them this morning. And actually, I'm impressed to see that, because that's I'm delighted to see that. That's my favorite way to recite the Four Vows, is in Japanese. But many people in Japan would not understand what that meant, because it was Japanese using Chinese grammar and concepts that might have been foreign to many of the people who recited. And I think I remember when I first began meditating at Diamond Sangha in Hawaii, it was meaningless to me, but it was a very important part of my practice at the time. I appreciated the opportunity to do that, but the meaning was lost on me. So why do we recite them in Japanese? Why do some of us recite them in Japanese? Why do we bother to translate them into English? Why do scholars feel hermeneutic anxiety when we can't translate it into meaning and give some explanation of what they mean? Do we need to do that? These are questions that have been floating through my mind for a while. Once I saw the English translation, I hadn't thought much about them before, but at the Santa Barbara Zen Center, we usually recited in English. And that was something that I hadn't done in former practice situations. So I began thinking about them, and I began to wonder about what the meaning of each one of the four vows had for us. But before I'll go there, that was kind of the initiation to this process that I got into. So just very simply, looking at monastic practice from the 8th century through the 12th century, there's a long study by Griffith Fulk on the practices and the way ritual was used in the monastery, in Chan monasteries, by and large, public Chan monasteries, in the capital and various cities around China. And based on those practices, we see also something very similar to what you were doing now. And Griff Fulk argues or presents the information that the recitations and the chanting didn't require translation. They were framing devices. There was a very strong ritual component to Dharma talks, to Teisho, that we still carry on today and that the Japanese carry on today. Although I feel we're losing bits of the formality that one can see in the Sung dynasty, at least in the United States. And I'm not commenting on Rinzai-Ji, as you've seen at other places. So you may be maintaining more of it than I realize. But it was a ritual framing device. It's a performance that accomplishes something. It's performative illocutionary acts. It marks the beginning or the end of a particular process. It is not a lecture to inform because it's repeated again and again exactly the same way it was first presented to the practitioner. That's an aspect of ritual. It wasn't necessary that it be comprehended intellectually. It was sung or chanted rather than simply read, which separated it from mundane conversations and informative lectures. It was generally done collectively. I don't know how often it was done alone. I do it alone when I practice at home, but generally it was a collective action. It's essentially devoid of new information. Once you've said it, you've gotten, if there's any information there, it's been available to you since the first time you recited it. Part of reciting it is like reciting mantras and even the Heart Sutra in Japanese. It gives it a sense in another language, in Sanskrit, in Chinese, in Japanese. It provides a kind of timeless conceit that this is the way it's been done since it was first propagated. And I think here's the direction I'm going with ritual. It is distinguished from thought, belief, or intention by intending to mold the somatic body, the sensual body, the senses, more than the mental aspect of one's participation. Intended to mold the somatic body. What do I mean by that? I was sitting out in my backyard today, having breakfast before we began this morning. And this flock of very small birds, who I usually have to look up again every year when they come back, were in the bird bath, and they were hopping around right next to me while I was eating breakfast. And they were chirping away, sometimes not to each other. They just chirp and be quiet and then take it back and do something. And it brought back to me one of my mentors at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, who was a professor in the Department of Philosophy and an expert in Sanskrit, and wrote a long study of the Agni Chayana, or the fire ritual, the Vedic fire ritual. And part of his analysis of the ritual was that it was meaningless. And in fact, it was a repeated set of actions that had no doctrinal meaning in the construction of the altar for the fire ritual. And then he goes on to look at some ornithological studies that argue that birds also perform ritual recitations in patterns that can be described, can be outlined. And a few fairly significant studies of bird chirping, bird song, actually. One can think also of whale song in the same sense, I think. And we assume that they're commuting information. But maybe it has much more to do with performing something that brings about responses and reactions without information, although who's to say? This was speculation on the part of Fritz Stahl, professor who was writing the study of the Agni Chayana. So again, I think it's a practice that accomplishes something. It addresses the somatic body. It molds the somatic body. And when I hear the Han being struck in any temple that I'm at, or a Zen temple primarily in Japan or in the United States, it immediately ignites 40 years of experience. It brings the body back into the presence of this experience that I had from the first time I heard the Han. It's one of my favorite parts of the entire ritual. And then, of course, the Heart Sutra in Japanese and the Four Vows in Japanese. So it has a somatic effect on me. I sense it. It brings me into presence of being there with the meditation practice I'm involved in at the time. And Griff Falk's argument is, or at least presentation is, that meditation is a highly ritualized practice. Not that the actual involvement in meditation at the time, he's not talking about that, but it's surrounded by ritual. And this is obvious, I think, to most of us when we bow 3 times and we do all of the rest, that ritualized actions on both sides of the meditation. The Dharma lecture, the Dharma hall, was a recreation of sutra descriptions of the Buddha lectures. The monks would march into the hall in a regular order, in order of hierarchy, actually. And on one side would be the trained monks, on the other side would be the novices. And there would be a formal few words by the abbot or the head priest, and he would mount the chair, replacing the seat that the Buddha would normally have been sitting in when he was lecturing. And it was a very formalized process. And then the leading disciples of the abbot would ask rhetorical questions, much in the pattern of the word records and koans. And this is what goes on in contemporary American practice when a person is brought into a new position and to lead the Sangha in a meditation period practice. So very similar, very ritualized process. So I started the thinking about this is, why do people recite it in foreign languages? Why do they translate it? Is there a need to translate it? And is there a need to what is translating it into English Where does that take us? And does that help us in any way? So before I move to the text itself, Robert Sharf wrote, to approach ritual as a text to be deciphered is tantamount to reducing music to a score or a territory to a map. Let me read that again. To approach ritual as a text, namely to be translated into English and committed that way, to be deciphered, to be explained, which is exactly what I'm going to proceed to do in about 2 minutes, is tantamount to reducing music to its score or a territory to a map. Or a painting of a cracker to a practice. Dogen. So now that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to move on to a discussion of what the text may actually mean. And I think of T.S. Eliot, in my end is my beginning, and is my beginning, my beginning is my end. The end is that we recite it in a ritual way in most cases. But in the beginning, it emerged out of a system of thought and theory that was developing in China in the 4th and 5th centuries, primarily among the Kegon or Huayan sect. And so we have 2 or 3 examples here of within the Kegon sect that takes us into the 4 vows. Then the Kegon developed the paramitas to include 4 more after the original 6. The 6th paramita, as you remember, was the prajna paramita, perfect wisdom. Kegon added upaya, or skillful means in transmission of the Dharma. That was the 7th. And the 8th was pranidhana, which was the perfection of the vow, which is what we do in the 4 vows, the perfection of the vow. In fact, it's quintessentially what we do in the 1st vow, because when that was explained, pranidhana, the vow was to save all beings using the knowledge of emptiness, prajna paramita. That was the 8th stage in the 10-stage process path to enlightenment, bodhisattvahood, in the Kegon tradition. So in the Kegon tradition, or Huayan tradition, bodhisattva path was a path. It was leading somewhere, and it went through stages, 10 stages. And in the case of the flower garland sutra, which is part of the Huayan, it was a 52-stage pilgrimage by Sudana, the monk, seeking enlightenment. And he comes back to where he started. He's doing the T.S. Eliot thing, comes back to Manjushri. He ends with Maitreya at the end of the first part and then goes back to Maitreya, to his teacher who sent him on this journey, this pilgrimage. So it's a process. It doesn't start with the original enlightenment. So we go to the text itself. Could we bring up the first page of the text? So I believe you have copies before you as well. I hope this is large enough. Yeah, I can see it. So the first term that I want to address is Shujo. It's usually translated sentient beings. Term itself means collection. Sattva dhatu is the Sanskrit Sattva means being. Sat is the verb to be, beings. And dhatu is the realm of beings, or the realm of sentient beings, which is probably the way it was usually understood. I like leaving some ambiguity there, and so does Redpine in his translation, of simply leaving as the realm of beings or beings. The muhan is an interesting term also to give some meaning to this particular vow. It means margin or boundary or frontier. Doesn't mean numberless or infinite. Arthur Eddington's talking about infinity said that to be unbounded does not mean to be infinite. And that's the meaning that I take from muhan. It's unbounded, but not necessarily infinite. So I like boundless or boundaryless as a better way of interpreting that particular term. Seigan is simply the vow or to aspire to. And do would be meaningless to most people who weren't tutored in Buddhism, which simply means to ferry across to the other shore of nirvana. So what does this mean? What does this mean in the context of Mahayana? We can move. Let's see if I can. Yeah, can we move down? Saving all beings according to the Prajnaparamita. Down a little further. Let's cite the Prajnaparamita. This is the Diamond Sutra. The Buddha told Subhuti. Subhuti was his one of his leading disciples. All bodhisattva mahasattvas should master their minds like this. Of all kinds of beings in the realm of beings, I've added that there. And this is the important part. Whether born, which incidentally sheng also means shujo sheng, born from egg, womb, moisture, metamorphosis, whether with form or without form, whether with perception, samjna, or without perception, or neither with perception or without perception. As far as any conceivable form of being is conceived, I cause them all to enter the nirvana without remainder, liberating them. The interesting line is, with perception or without perception. With perception is a sentient being, is a being born without perception, or neither perception or non-perception, a sentient being. I leave that as a question. But it's one of the reasons I prefer to leave it simply as being, a being that is born. And that's because when we get to Dongshan, one of my foci as a graduate student, he discovers that the Master Nanyang teaches that non-sentient beings expound the Dharma. And the example Nanyang gives is birds and trees. All things expound the Dharma. So my translation of that line would leave the ambiguity there. All beings. It's perfectly legitimate to translate it as sentient beings. That's not wrong. But it provides a bit of ambiguity, it seems to me, if we leave that simply as beings. So the question is, in that first line, who is saved and who is doing the saving? It's an act of objectification and agency. Who's doing the saving? Who's the agent? Who's being saved? Now notice in the Japanese and Chinese, well, the Chinese originally, there's no personal pronoun. Not that it wasn't assumed that in vowing, there's an individual that vows, but it represses that strong sense of agency. I vow. It's still there, but it's a little more subliminal, I think. And to save others is also a bit of a problem, it seems to me, as Zen developed and Chan developed in China. And we see that in first initiated in the latter, is section 3 of the Diamond Sutra that continues. Thus, by liberating immeasurable, incalculable, illimitable beings, in reality, there are no beings who attain liberation, no objectification. Why is this, Subhuti? If bodhisattvas have the conception of self, an individual or a lifetime, an individual beings or a lifespan, they are not bodhisattvas. That's the logic of the Prajna Paramita. And according to Hui Neng, in the Platform Sutra, I vow to save all beings, no matter how numberless. In saying that, it isn't Hui Neng who does the saving, good friends. Every being you can conceive of, every being you can think of saves themselves with their own nature in their own bodies. So both the Diamond Sutra and Hui Neng start by reciting the traditional line, which sounds like the beginning of the pilgrimage that Sudana takes, or that the Four Vows start with. We start on the journey, we head towards nirvana, and then we find out there's a different goal altogether. And so both of these, both Eno, Hui Neng, and the Diamond Sutra, immediately after saying that they save all beings, say, well, that's not exactly what it means. And then go on to explain what it means to them or to the sutra. So in thinking about Do, to cross over, I prefer to think about it that way. And I think that lends more credibility to the later Buddhist position. The Huayan evolves in that direction, and I think Tendai does as well. So that's line 1. That was more complex than the other lines. They'll go rather quickly now. So on to the second page. Cutting off afflictions. Afflictions are a large set of problems. And I've listed those below as they occur in Vasubandhu's 30 verses. It's not just ignorance, it's not just desire. It's all of those listed below: desire, aversion, delusion, pride, wrong view, doubt, anger, hatred, hypocrisy, malice, envy, selfishness, and so on. So what we often see in the translation of Bonno, kleshas, those were all the kleshas, a synecdoche in which only one of them is chosen to represent the entire group. And the one that's most effective, I think, is probably delusion. And that's what the sixth patriarch, sixth ancestor goes to. He says, the afflictions are cut off when delusion is cut off and when wisdom is attained. You don't have to do anything else. Once you cut off delusion, the other afflictions will dissolve of themselves, or it's at least implied that that's what will happen. So how to translate that as either afflictions or delusion, it doesn't matter to me. I think they both work. But it's not one thing. It's not simply desire. It's many things, and it's encompassed in all those. So the Tendai tradition, in the person of Tiantai Juri, and then later on by one of his much later followers, 2 or 3, 4 centuries later, Zhi Li sends a letter to one of his comrades, and he said, other than Buddha, evil, afflictions, other than Mara, which is equivalent to saying the afflictions, there is no Buddha. Other than the Buddha, there are no afflictions. Within Buddha, there are all the afflictions. Within Mara, there is the Buddha. It seems to me that takes it to its logical conclusion. So the problem then arises, why are we cutting them off? We're doing something else with them. It's not that we don't seek to end them, I think. But cutting off to me struck as a bit too strict. So I leave that on the table if anyone wants to raise a question about that. The next one is easy. Bring scholarship back into it, which I appreciate. The homon are without number. I vow to study them. It's easier to translate that, master. What's informative about that is there are many mon, and one gets the sense even in Huineng that meditation isn't the only mon, and that ritual may also be one of the mon, but there are innumerable mons, innumerable gates. And the first image that comes to my mind when I see that line, and if any of you have been to Fushimi Inari in Kyoto, you've seen what I visualize, which is a line of torii gates. There must be 100 of them or so, spaced only 5 or 10 feet away from each other, that lead up the mountain towards the shrine itself. It's a Shinto shrine, originally connected with the Buddhists before the Meiji Restoration, but presently a Shinto shrine. So a set of gates with spaces in between that provide light that stand out when you look at this particular set of gates. So that's what I visualize. That's what I see when that line comes up. The last line is I'll end with this one. Deals with the path. The important thing about translating Buddha way is that's the way. I'm not using it in the same sense that the Chinese and probably the Japanese until modernization talked about what we call an ism, a Buddhism, a Taoism, a Confucianism, rather than making it an ism, which to me is a very static concept. Using the word path or course is a much more dynamic process. It's an ongoing course. It doesn't essentialize Buddhism or Taoism or Confucianism into one set of essential teachings and values. It's an ongoing process. It's active, it's engaged. So I'll touch on that more after I complete some of the other comments on this particular line. Muzhou, zhou means up or top or summit or end, peak. So it could be translated unascendable. And perhaps as Red Pine translates it, I think makes better sense. Transcendent, in the sense that it can't be summited, but nonetheless, one vows to accomplish or perfect it. Now, let's go back to Tao. Today, you chanted the Heart Sutra. The first line is the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, coursing, the way it's translated from Sanskrit, in the deep wisdom of the Prajna Paramita. Looks down and sees suffering beings and reveals the 5 skandhas as empty. Now, if you put up the JPEG, I'll illustrate what I mean by course or way. Nothing connected. Can anybody see the handwritten JPEG? There it is, yeah. I had a delightful old Russian emigre professor. I can't even think of his name now. I've been talking too much. Delightful professor.
Budberg.
Budberg, yeah. Who said that? That you get 5 stars for that. Not many people know Dr. Budberg, Professor Budberg. He trained himself in Chinese and Japanese, and he was a specialist in analyzing the early kanji and characters, which she called semiology. And this meant not just looking at pictures, but looking at the history of the way they entered discourse and how they were put together. And he brought up the notion that Tao could be translated course, in the sense that it was something what could be on course, it could be dynamic, or it could be a course of training. It later takes on the sense of a principle, although that's a more static view, a road or a path. And what makes that possible is the analysis of the component on the right, on the left, which is a category marker. It's called a radical, which generally categorizes a term as something that involves going or going over or doing, action, doing something. The interesting component is shou, which means head. But also in early Chinese bone inscriptions and bronze inscriptions, meant something like load head. This is Budberg's translation. Load is in a Middle English term, meaning a deposit of ore, as in the mother lode, or a load of gold. So a load head is what attracts the head of a needle, a compass. It's a deposit of magnetite for us in the Northern Hemisphere, up in northeastern Canada. In China, it was also pointed to more or less to the north. And so a course is something that one follows, that one doesn't see necessarily, but one is able to follow because of the magnetism that's there. So it's a natural course. It's a natural way that one travels on. And that may be one way to think about Buddhism as a course, or Buddha course, Buddha Tao, but also the 4th vow as a course that one travels on, that may have no end. It's unsurmountable, but the one will follow all the way. But it also takes us back to the 1st vow. What does the Bodhisattva do? By simply putting a hand under Tao, under the original character, and that little squiggle at the bottom means it was originally the picture of a hand, means to guide or lead. And that's the presentation of the Bodhisattva in the Lotus Sutra. In the chapter of the magical city, the Bodhisattva guides with upaya the suffering beings of the world. So I think that lends more depth, actually, to the final vow and takes us into the meaning. And with that, I'll show you the translation that I threw together after all these thoughts. So go back to the last page, and I'll end there. This is Red Pine's translation with a few emendations that I've thrown in. I vow to save all beings, no matter how boundless, or perhaps boundaryless. I changed he used innumerable, I changed it to boundless. I vow to end all afflictions, no matter how inexhaustible. I vow to master all teachings, no matter how numberless. I vow to course the Buddha path, no matter how transcendent. Incidentally, I also exchanged uh, the second vow to inexhaustible. It means to use up, to exhaust. So one uses up the afflictions and they're exhausted. So that's a tentative translation that I don't think you need, or that I need. I was just driven by hermeneutic anxiety to produce something like that. I think we can continue to chant the four vows as they were written in Japanese pronunciations of strange Chinese grammar to the Japanese. And if we're interested, we can look at the translation that I've suggested here. So I end with that and invite comments in the little remaining time I think we have, or simply a comment. If someone wishes to comment, please go ahead.
I have a quick question about your first slide, where you had the, I think it was the third or fourth chapter of the Diamond Sutra, and you pointed out the character Samjna, which is the third skanda. And there's also form and no form in that verse as well. I was wondering, is that Rupa?
Let's see. I'll go back to that. I need to see what you were referring to there.
In the first slide.
Oh yeah, here we are.
Yeah, with whether with perception or without perception.
Ah, yes.
And then before that is whether with form or without form, and you have in italics here samjna. So I thought you were bringing our attention to that.
Samya is the perception,
right?
And
yes.
Then the form is not the form of rupa.
Oh, okay.
It's shang. It has the heart underneath the character for shang. It's not there. I don't have it online right now.
Okay.
So that's from the Diamond Sutra. Yeah. What do you think of that? That's an interesting comment. It's always translated sentient beings in the first part of what the Diamond Sutra is saying, and yet he goes on to say with perception, without perception. Seems to contradict where he started, where the text started. And that's a big part of Dongshan's, a lot of his discourse record plays on the notion that non-sentient beings teach the Dharma. Yeah,
so,
Ken?
Bill, thank you. That's a wonderful talk. I love the way you kind of focused us down line by line, character by character, and pulled some of the characters apart using, I didn't realize you'd studied with Peter Budberg, who was a unique human being from everything I've heard from people who've studied with him. I didn't realize you had. And also Fritz Stahl, who is kind of a hero to me, not so much for his incredible video about the Agni fire ritual, but for writing this very controversial book in 1975 called Exploring Mysticism, in which he argued to people who want to study mysticism that if you really want to study it, you've got to practice it as well. And I remember being very influenced by that book. And it's kind of led me to the eventual establishment of a contemplative studies program here at Brown, in which we do basically that. I mean, when we study Buddhist meditation texts, we do the meditations that are associated with them in the classroom setting, that kind of situation. And I wanted to ask you if your hermeneutic anxiety had been satisfied by the exercise that you did, and if you think it's more than just, a hermeneutic anxiety for a scholar, but do you agree with Scharf that what you've just done is, I don't know, taken the map and or taken the musical score and just looked at the musical scores. So that content is meaningless. And I'll just say that in our practice tradition, I mean, Roshi really emphasized chanting for the sound, and I think there's something really right there about chanting as a ritual that brings you into the present, and that helps. I like that molds the somatic body. I love that phrase because I think that being embodied is a kind of essential foundation for our practice that we often miss if we're only concerned with the meaning. But do you think that the meaning is essentially irrelevant? And if not, then you know, what is its relevance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one that I've been thinking a lot about. No, the chanting is meaningless, but it's not that it's not meaningful. In the sense that when I started with T.S. Eliot, and my end is my beginning, I go back to the beginning and see that our practice is informed by theory and meaning. In other words, that it exists in the Kegon Sutras. And those were meaningful statements within the context of sutra discussion and interpretation, hermeneutics of sutra. But once the interpretation was there, you can go on to the recitation. And I'd rather see, I would take the line from Zhi Li, inside the Buddha are the afflictions, inside afflictions of the Buddha. Inside the recitation is the theory, inside the theory is the recitation. So I will play both sides. I will do I'll play their game, the sutra games. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. It's not different from emptiness, not different from form.
So your hermeneutic anxiety is satisfied. You're no longer hermeneutically anxious.
I never was. I just use that as to kind of front myself before I go into and analyze it because I have to.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for explaining why some Zendos do chant it the traditional way and some chant it in English. I've wondered about that, having attended different sittings where they do it one way or the other. I always wondered why that was. So thank you for explaining that.
I have to say that my initial experience in most of the Zendos that I've participated in, it's usually been done in Japanese. I think maybe we're evolving. I don't know. It doesn't sound like Rinzai-Ji is, but I think there's some transitions taken. We've gone from our original teachers. Yasutani Roshi was one of my original teachers, Yasutani and Soen Roshi, and Aiken Roshi. Aiken was the next generation, and now we're moving beyond that. And some of the chanting, some of the practices are changing. America is not attuned to ritual very much. I think it's hard for us to do it in the way that Japan does it, and the Chinese are masters. The Chinese are a ritual culture. It was one of the prime virtues of the Confucian tradition. Confucius said, if I'm not there present in the sacrifice to the ancestors, then it's as though I haven't been there at all. And the sacrifice brings the presence, the person into the presence of the ancestors for Confucius. So it's a culture for which ritual is not a big problem. In fact, it's basically the way they negotiate. So a lot of the things that I said about ritual, I think characterize Chinese culture in general. America, we're doing other things with it. Some places are. And that's fine. I don't object to that. I'm happy to recite them in English. But one other thing I would point out about the Japanese recitation, they're 7-word lines. And each line is 7 words. It's almost like a poem. And it has a certain rhythm to it, a certain assonance to it. that I get from Japanese that I don't get from English translations. It just sounds like reading a book. So yes, I appreciate the Japanese reading of the vows personally. So go on chanting. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful talk. It opened up some new ways of thinking about even the room in which we sit. When you spoke of 4 attributes that the room represents, that there's a sense, you spoke of the monks on one side and the lay on the other, and I was curious about the other 2, but before I hope to hear from you on that. I'd just like to comment on your choice of language for the vows, especially the first and the fourth were especially compelling. The notion to dequantify the notion of sentient beings as you do. Instead of numberless, you say boundless, and that's a very powerful transition from my understanding of the vows up to now, of that vow, that particular. And also the last vow, when you substitute course for way, which is wonderfully expansive because it not only, as a noun, it opens up new possibilities, but it also, you finally use it as a verb, so it becomes an action. Even more of a dynamic sense to it. So I just want to thank you for those insights through that language. I'd also like to just comment that Roshi, when you mentioned, and I can't remember who it was that you spoke of as having mentioned birds and trees as being sentient. Sasaki Roshi sometimes talk about rocks and stones as sentient. So there's and even one of his senior students once spoke, and I didn't hear Roshi talk about this, but as of sounds as a non-material thing having sentience as well. So that really finally is all inclusive, boundlessly inclusive. So, but if I could return to that question of the way you spoke of the Zendo as being a kind of a representation or an instantiation of our practice and the way in which we live. It's kind of almost like a hierarchies or the roles that are implicit within it.
Yeah, that's an argument, or that's a description that Griff Folk makes in his delightful study of Tang and Sung Dynasty monastic practice. And Scharf also compares the Zendo being changed from a Buddha hall to a Dharma hall. The name being changed in the public monasteries in that early period, as in a sense a Pure Land, a simulated Pure Land. And that there's actually a performance. It does something in addition to informing you with information. It creates a somatic body. And often the responses of the abbot or whoever was sitting in the Dharma chair would be typically rhetorical in the sense that Zen discussions, and even today, what's the ritual when a practice period person is, I can't think of the name of that ritual in Zen, when the practice period begins with a new shiso. When the shiso takes over, there's this dramatic question and response in the traditional Zen rhetorical fashion that seems to have had its precedent in the Sung Dynasty monasteries. Very performative.
Thank you.
We have a question out in Rinzai-Ji from Rebecca.
Oh,
Hello.
hi, Rebecca.
You probably need
Hello.
to come closer.
Okay, coming up. Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, as we've had previous conversations about the compass and that concept, I'm wondering if you'd speak a little bit more to that, please.
Yeah, Rebecca, I have to blame you for that whole little riff that I did there because you raised the question 2 years ago. And I went into a kind of tailspin till I could figure all that out. So, and explain it in some way. There's far too much to explain, but I like the sense of, Alan Watts wrote a book called The Watercourse Way. And I first thought maybe that's a very poetic and nice kind of translation of it. But lode in Middle English also meant a natural waterway. So it was the course that water would take as it flowed from the mountains to the ocean. And it could be called a lodeway. And Peter Budberg also translated it as lode head, using the component show in there. So it's a path that isn't visible, that is sensed. It's part of us, it's in us already. We can follow, we start in different places. I like all the ramifications of this. We all start in different places. Different things bring us to practice. And the road's probably different for all of us, but there is a compass that takes us maybe in a different path than the person next to us, but eventually heads us in the right direction. That's upaya. So it opens itself up to a lot of interpretations and playfulness. The Chinese knew, they understood magnetism. There was a diviner's plate that we can trace back to the 3rd century BCE, in which a plate that represented the cosmos, a wooden plate, was constructed. And on the middle of that, the Big Dipper was placed, a spoon that looked like the Big Dipper. It was the shape of the Big Dipper. The heavy end was the scooping end where you have the soup, and then there was the handle. Well, if there's magnetism, the heavy end of this magnetite is going to swing towards north, and the handle is going to swing south. Where does the abbot sit in the temple, in metropolitan temples in China and Japan? The abbot sits in the north and looks south. Many of the monasteries in China are built even in the mountains. The mountain that I did a lot of work on, Zhouhuashan, the ridge of the mountain runs kind of northeast, southwest, but they turn the front of the temple so that it faces south, the entry gate. Then everything else as you move back through the temple, adjusted to the shape of the ridge. But that importance of the south lining up with the south. Confucius said, when the emperor faces south, the rest of the cosmos will take its position correctly. Everyone will fall in line. So there's this kind of geomantic principle that alignment with qi, Chinese would call it qi or qi, in the cosmos is what allows things to flow naturally. It allows for suchness. It accounts for suchness in the Buddhist tradition, I think. So finding that inner compass is part of the problem of staying on course. And no one can tell you what that course is completely except yourself. And that's what the 6 patriarchs, 6 ancestor argues. Thank you for asking that question again.
So, Bill and Rebecca, I have sent Gion and Bill a copy of Peter Budberg's 1956 article in which he proposes, he translates the first chapter of the foundational Taoist work, the Daodejing, and talks about his understanding of why Tao, among other things, why Tao should be translated as loadhead. So it's if anybody wants a copy, check with Gion, and I also sent I just sent you it, Gion, and also Bill, I sent you a copy.
Believe it or not, I have a copy. That was the basis. That was the basis of what I was saying just now. Actually, that was the source that it came from. The rest of the discussion is it's mind blowing. Peter Budberg is way off in a different world in this, and it's wonderful.
It is. And there, one of his students, who I think was in an earlier generation than you, Benjamin Wallaker, used Budbergian principles to translate a whole chapter of the Taoist compendium Huainanzi. And it's unique. It's a little hard to find, that one.
It's the most important contribution I think it made to my study of Chinese from then on. He died the second year I was at Berkeley. He was a dignified old, he would wear looked like a Swiss little cap with a feather in it and a neat tacky suit. And he would tell jokes in multiple languages because he was a Russian. He was trained in French, German, Latin, Greek. And he would tell jokes by playing with words in different languages. And most of us in the class only knew 2 or 3 other languages. So we were challenged in understanding his humor. So sometimes we'd get together after the lecture and put together our languages and figure out, we knew it was a joke because he had this remarkable laugh. He would go, he would say something, then he'd go, everyone right there, write that down. What did he just say? What language was that? And then his last lecture was poignant, to say the least. He translated a Tang Dynasty poem about a cricket that sits on, and the poet writing to how beautiful the singing of the cricket was in fall. And then he realizes, you're going to die. This is fall, and you won't be with me again. But that's all right. You'll be back in spring, or something of you will be back in spring. He died that summer after that last course. So poignant, whatever it was, he was a delightful person. Fritz Stahl was also unique.
Stahl, I corresponded with by email, but never got a chance to meet. But it was Stahl's inspiration in exploring mysticism that led me 20 years ago to start actually chanting with my students in the classroom. But I got into trouble. You know, it was all chanting, was the Heart Sutra and the Dharani for removing disasters and the Four Great Vows. That some students wanted to know what we were chanting. And so I translated the Four Great Vows. And of course, the act of doing a religious practice in a classroom setting was very radical and verboten in the academy. It's as my colleagues subsequently told me, who tried to block me from doing this, it's no different from getting your students to get down on their knees and accept Jesus as their savior. Completely the same thing. So when I translated the Four Vows, 2 students made a formal complaint to my department chair that I had magically made them become Buddhists. And that's when they came down really hard on me. But I had anticipated this move, and I had, anyway, outmaneuvered them and kept going in what I was doing. But just the idea of translating the meaning of the Four Vows, kind of what you were talking about today, is what got me into trouble with my senior colleagues at the time.
I think it's gotten worse.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do too.
Yes.
On that subject of chanting without meaning, I remember once attending. It was a retreat for faculty of Catholic universities, and I teach at a Catholic university, a Jesuit university, and there was a discussion of chanting at one point, and I suggested that we might do the Lord's Prayer, but in the way that we chant, the Heart Sutra. And there was a religious that was in that particular study. It was a study group, and she was very taken by it. She said, "I've never after we did it 3 times. And she said, I've never done that before. But that was a very different experience. And as if to say that it was something from which she got some benefit, some insight. So I was happy to be able to share that with her, based on a Buddhist kind of a translation of Buddhist practice into a Christian sphere.
You know, this whole problem of ritual goes back to my beginnings and involvement in the peace movement in the late or early 60s, anti-nuclear peace movement. We went and did. We sat in front of Vandenberg Air Force Base for a weekend, protesting the development of nuclear weapons and so on. And that took me into the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. And that took me into Quaker practice. And Quaker practice has no ritual. There's no priest. You sit down, you're quiet, you speak when the spirit calls, and then you shut up again. Well, that was fine, except I missed it. When I finally found ritual again, I said, okay, this feels better. I feel a little better now. I'm back where I belong. So, but it was that I grew up within the Puritan Protestant world of denying the use of the importance of symbols, or no, that's not entirely true. But in any case, it led me to the Catholics, Dorothy Day, peace movement.
Yeah. Really wonderful, an exemplar. And now, and speaking of, you know, the protests in those days, now we have climate change immolation, self-immolation, as of just a few days ago.
Yeah.
Very bad, but also very powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate your talk. Always from the very beginning of my Zen practice back in the 70s, I was always bothered by the translation of the Four Vows, because it seemed somehow the common translation of I vow to do this, I vow to do that, was contrary to, you know, getting rid of this self-centered me. So I always felt also, I got exposed to Sanskrit early on, and just understanding how far away we can get from the intention of the ancient language when we try and force it into English. So I was always a little bit suspicious of the translation of the Four Vows, and I really appreciate how you elucidated a lot of that and given me something to contemplate.
Yeah, I think maybe the Four Vows started out much more conventional than they became by the Tang Dynasty. When the Kegon or Huayan tradition in the early part, in the 4th and 5th century, were working with these Buddhist texts and sutras and so on, they were really part of what some scholars now call mainstream Buddhism, as opposed to Mahayana. Mahayana is a subcategory of mainstream Buddhism, but there were Buddhists of many stripes, Buddhist practitioners of the Buddha way. And in fact, there were Buddhisms all existing within a single monastery. And what held them together was the ritual and the vows, the pratimoksha vows that govern monastic practice. And even when the monasteries in the Sung Dynasty became Chan monasteries, the practice was the same as it had been 600 years earlier. And it incorporated people who weren't Chan practitioners, people who were part of the Pure Land tradition and other groups as well. They could all live within the same monastery. But it was the pratimoksha, the vows, and the understanding that they could all still chant the vows without being tied to a meaning that may have existed early on in the creation of the vows, namely that we're going to save people. So it tells us one thing about ritual. Rituals are not timeless. They change over time. And the meaning we attach to rituals also changes over time. Nothing is permanent. Things change. What part of the ritual changes? Small parts. I was having dinner. When I was living at this mountain in China, Zhouhua, I would have dinner with the abbot of the abbot of the entire mountain every night because I was staying in his monastery. And I noticed during the release of life ritual, he'd given me a copy of the ritual text. I was reading the map and he didn't follow the map. So at dinner, I said to him, look, it says at this point, you go around the altar 3 times. You went 4 times and it looked like you were starting to go a 5th time. Why did you do that? He said, oh, I dropped the incense one time, so I had to go around again to pick it up and put it in. So there was this it was just matter of fact. Rituals are not sacrosanct. We can throw these little clicks in there. And then I noticed that the rituals evolved considerably from some of the early ritual texts as well. So they're not as timeless as they seem, but that timelessness is a nice quality that comes across in the normal recitation. And why do we change our voice when we recite? Same issue. It separates what's happening in the Dharma hall from mundane, ordinary existence. Even though we don't want to do that, ultimately, we take the sacred into the mundane as well. It gets complex at that. I'm getting beyond myself. I'm not a Dharma teacher, so I'll leave you to work that one out.
I think that's a really great place to end. Thank you so much, Bill. I feel like I just took one of your classes and it makes me sad that I didn't get to take more of them. So it was a real pleasure to have you here. And I also wanted to say that the Rinzai-Ji Zendo, which is in a building that was constructed prior to it being a Zendo, does face south. It does orient towards the south. The door is on the southern end and the Buddha faces towards the south. So I thought that was
the natural lighting is spectacular.
Okay, well, anyway, so thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you for your questions. Bye.